All right, America's largest bourbon maker, Jim Beam, is pausing production at its flagship facility in Kentucky. The distiller is owned by Japan's Suntory.
For years, everyone thought American bourbon was untouchable. Then, almost overnight, everything stopped. Orders vanished, shipments returned unopened, and billion-dollar brands suddenly couldn't give their product away in markets they once dominated. This was just the beginning of something that would send shockwaves throughout America.
Here, get this. So far this summer, Brown-Forman, Wild Turkey, and this week, Bullet Distillery, they're based, of course, in Shelbyville, all reporting drops in bourbon sales, and experts tell us it's time now.
Imagine a giant American distillery filling a ship with its premium bourbon, only to receive news weeks later that the vessel is sitting motionless at a dock terminal. And just when you might think that things couldn't get any worse, it's revealed that phone calls from overseas buyers have also ceased. Nobody is interested in the bourbon anymore. Export orders have been declining month after month with no explanation. It was obvious from the onset that the story wasn't heading in a good direction. To understand things a bit better of where it all began, we have to rewind just a few years earlier to 2023. The state of Kentucky alone was producing roughly 95% of the world's bourbon, storing over 12.6 million barrels. That's nearly 3 barrels for every resident. In that same year, American whiskey exports hit a record of $1.4 billion, with brands like Jim Beam, Maker's Mark, and Buffalo Trace dominating global shelves. Based on these numbers, it was evident that this business was booming. Families like the Beams had operated distilleries for 7 generations since 1795. 30 relatives of founder Jacob Beam had run distilleries, developing over 40 different brands. These had surpassed normal corporations and were now dynasties built on limestone-filtered water, fertile soil perfect for corn, and secrets passed down through centuries. For decades, bourbon represented more than spirits. Congress declared it America's native spirit in 1964, cementing its cultural significance. From Kentucky's rolling hills to Tennessee's charred oak warehouses, these distilleries thrived. The industry generated roughly $285 million in state tax revenue for Kentucky annually and sustained 50,000 jobs in cooperage and forestry nationwide. The assumption was unshakable. American whiskey would always reign supreme. Then, suddenly, the warning signs appeared. At first, they were subtle and easy to dismiss. African import orders began tapering off. At first, it seemed like the usual dip in demand before it went back to the normal margins. But after some weeks, the decline was too dramatic to ignore. Shipping manifests showed unusual patterns as distributors who had ordered for decades simply stopped. But despite all this, Washington wasn't paying attention. Policy advisors focused obsessively on trade negotiations with Europe and China. Africa was simply an afterthought, barely worth mentioning in economic briefings. What nobody in America realized was that while they weren't watching, an entire continent was building something powerful. And by the time distilleries noticed the silence from the African buyers, it was already too late. The empire built over 2 centuries was about to crumble. But this collapse didn't happen in a vacuum. It all started with a policy decision that seemed routine at the time. You see, in April 2025, sweeping US tariffs hit African imports, ranging from a baseline 10% on some countries to staggering 50% on others like Lesotho. Washington's justification? Trade deficits. The tariffs effectively ended the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which since 2000 had granted duty-free access to US markets for thousands of African products. This move was the defining moment, one that triggered a common thought among African leaders. They agreed that time was ripe for Africa to demand dignified treatment and to have an equal say in global trade negotiations. We want to engage, South African Deputy President Paul Mashatile said publicly. But behind closed doors, the message was different. After decades of being told how to trade, when to trade, and at what cost, African governments had reached a breaking point. Some countries like Uganda resolved to build more resilient and self-sustaining economies rather than beg for exemptions. Simply put, what Washington had initially dismissed as minor trade friction was actually a continent mobilizing. African governments had already encouraged local distilling industries since the 1950s and 1960s as part of industrialization policies. Now, this move by Washington prompted them to double down. Ghana's Gihok Distilleries, established in 1958, ramped up production of gin, rum, and whiskey, meeting international quality standards. Nigeria Distilleries Limited, the country's largest spirits manufacturer since 1961, also expanded their award-winning portfolio. In Lagos, Pedro's transformed traditional palm-based spirits into premium exports, reaching Ghana, the UK, Kenya, In Australia, South Africa wasn't left behind either as its craft distilleries began winning global awards. The irony was brutal. American tariffs meant to protect domestic producers, instead gifted African distillers the perfect excuse to compete. Local spirits were suddenly patriotic choices and not just affordable alternatives. Consumers embraced them, governments subsidized them, and investors weren't shy to inject massive capital into them. By the time American distillers realized what was happening, African brands were already displacing them on store shelves across the continent. The perfect storm had arrived, and this was just the beginning. In Kentucky, towns built on generations of whiskey making began to crumble as revenue streams that had sustained communities for over a century suddenly dried up. This triggered what many locals described as the darkest period in history. Things got even worse after master distillers received termination notices. These were men and women whose grandfathers had taught their fathers, who had taught them the art of making the most premium whiskey. These were no longer just jobs disappearing. Far from it. It was identities being torn apart. Families who had perfected their craft across 3 generations watched helplessly as their legacy evaporated overnight. Corn farmers who had supplied grains for decades weren't spared either as they watched contracts vanish overnight. Prices for wheat and rye also collapsed as demand plummeted. On the other side, main streets and distillery towns transformed into ghost corridors as local shops shuttered their windows. Schools faced budget crises as tax revenues disappeared, and the infrastructure that had thrived on whiskey's prosperity began collapsing under its own weight. What made all of this unbearable was the contrast. While American warehouses stood empty and silent, reports emerged of bustling African distilleries that were expanding, hiring, and thriving than ever before. The whiskey that America had perfected was no longer a critical good for Africa. Rather, the continent had come of age and was not producing its own product with increasing sophistication. For workers who had once taken pride in their American craftsmanship, the humiliation cut deeper than the financial loss. They couldn't stand watching their life's work become obsolete, their community disintegrate, and seeing their country's reputation diminished on the global stage. While America struggled, something remarkable was happening across the Atlantic. African entrepreneurs were building new facilities and launching aged product lines. Contrary to what many thought, this wasn't about copying Western models anymore. It signaled intense commitment toward manufacturing products that resonated with the African heritage. Distillers incorporated indigenous botanicals such as rooibos, buchu, wild rosemary, and marula. That move alone helped them create terroir-driven spirits that couldn't be replicated anywhere else. Local consumers embraced these homegrown brands and saw them as symbols of cultural celebration and economic independence and sovereignty. Meanwhile, American boardrooms were filled with intense conversations about what went wrong. How had an industry that dominated for over a century found itself so vulnerable? The answers were uncomfortable. Decades of assumed superiority had bred complacency. Emerging markets had been underestimated, and their potential dismissed until it was too late. The situation on the ground was grimmer. Kentucky now stored a record 16.1 million aging barrels. This was whiskey that would not be ready until after 2030. The cruel irony, this massive inventory represented preparation for a market that had fundamentally shifted. Some distilleries attempted pivots such as pursuing partnerships, local investments, and diversifying markets. But for many, these strategies arrived too late after the damage was too big to contain. By then, the harsh reality had already set in. No industry, regardless of legacy or prestige, is immune from global forces. America learned the hard way that economic power doesn't remain static when rising competitors refuse to be underestimated. Africa eventually made it clear that the era of guaranteed dominance had ended. This is just one of the ways that Africa is reclaiming its sovereignty. Remember to subscribe, as the next video will reveal another major move that Africa had made and which has caught Washington completely flat-footed.